The rain hit the windshield like shrapnel. Thick, sharp, endless. Emily gripped the steering wheel of her old Jeep tighter as the wipers struggled to keep up with the storm. Night blurred around her, highway lights stretched like veins across the wet blacktop, and every few seconds thunder growled low above the ridgeline. She had driven this stretch of road 100 times before, but tonight everything felt different, colder, heavier. Then her phone lit up on the passenger seat. One name, Mark. She hesitated before answering. Her heart picked up speed, but not from the road. From memory. From the weight that came every time she heard his voice. She tapped the call open on speaker and tried to keep her tone neutral. Mark spoke first, like he always did. "You know, I've been thinking. I finally figured it out. Your PTSD. It's just a fancy label for failure." Her knuckles went white around the steering wheel. She said nothing. He chuckled lightly like he was sharing a joke. "You cracked under pressure, Em, and now you want the world to call it trauma instead of what it really is. Weakness." The car stayed steady, but her pulse didn't. He kept going. "You went to war and came back expecting sympathy for doing your job. But real life, real pressure. You can't handle it. That's why you're stuck where you are. Hiding in therapy, hiding from responsibility." She could barely breathe. The rain sounded louder somehow, like it was mocking her too. Emily swallowed. "Why did you call Mark?" Her voice came out even, colder than she felt. He didn't answer directly, just sighed like a disappointed father. "You know your mother wouldn't have put up with this pity act. She was tougher. Not all this therapy nonsense, not all these excuses." Emily blinked hard, vision blurring for a second, but not from the storm, from something deeper, something older. A memory, like a wound, her mother lying in a hospital bed, Mark standing over her, always speaking for her, always deciding what she would have said. He had been rewriting her legacy for years. She hung up without saying another word. The line cut to silence. Her hands shook. Not from fear, not from sadness, from fury, from restraint, from the ache of 1,000 unsaid words boiling beneath her ribs. She wanted to scream. Instead, she kept driving. 1 mile. 2. Then the headlights in front of her swerved violently. A semi-truck cut across lanes, tires shrieking in water and metal. Emily slammed the brakes. The Jeep fish-tailed wheels sliding on the rain-slicked road. Her seatbelt snapped tight across her chest as the vehicle spun once, then straightened. Horns blared, lights flashed, but she kept control. Barely. The truck missed her by inches and thundered past. The adrenaline hit her like a second storm. Her breath came fast, ragged. She pulled to the shoulder and sat there, engine idling, rain pounding the roof like war drums. She could still hear Mark's voice in her head, that smug certainty that twisted belief that surviving meant failing. She looked down at her hands. Steady now. She had trained for worse. She had flown evac choppers through missile zones, carried bleeding men through jungle fires. She had held pressure on wounds so deep they screamed through bandages. But nothing had ever cut deeper than Mark's voice when he said weakness. She reached into the glove compartment and pulled out the challenge coin she always kept there. Navy Air Rescue. Her old unit's crest gleamed faint in the stormlight. She pressed it into her palm and closed her fingers tight. This wasn't about war anymore. It was about a different kind of battlefield, one where the enemy wore your last name and smiled while cutting you apart. The rain softened slightly, but her pulse didn't. She put the car back in drive. On the radio static gave way to soft jazz, ironic, cruelly calm. Her phone buzzed again. Same name. Mark. She ignored it. 10 minutes later, she would get another call. Not from him, from a state trooper. And that call would change everything. The hospital lights had always been too bright. Even before the diagnosis, before the chemo, before the whispered arguments in hallway corners about whether Mom could make it through another round. Emily had spent months in those corridors, walking them like a soldier on night patrol. Her boots silent, her eyes tired, her voice never loud enough to compete with Mark's. He had stepped into the role of caretaker like a man claiming a throne. He decided who spoke to the doctors, who got updates, who saw the charts. He told Emily she was too emotional, too reactive, too unstable to help. At 26, Emily was already back from 2 tours decorated steady-handed under fire, but in Mark's eyes, she was still a glass girl. Fragile. Breakable. That's how it had always been. He didn't raise her, but he stepped into her life just in time to break what little remained of it. After her mom passed, Mark didn't grieve publicly. He hosted, organized, controlled. At the funeral, he barely mentioned her name. Instead, he spoke about legacy, about values, about strength. He said the word strength 6 times. Emily counted. Not once did he mention kindness. He had always hated vulnerability, especially in women, especially in her. When Emily was diagnosed with PTSD, he laughed. Not the loud, obvious laugh worse, the low, disappointed exhale of someone convinced they had always been right. So it finally got to you, huh? All that military stuff. Knew it was a matter of time. She had just told him she was getting help, that she was in group therapy, that she'd finally admitted the nightmares were more than just echoes. And that was what he gave her. Pity disguised as pride. Condescension masked as fatherly concern. "I knew you were struggling," he said. "That's why I always kept an eye on you. Kept you grounded. Grounded. Like a punishment. Like she was a child who'd misbehaved." Emily remembered walking out of that conversation with her stomach twisted in knots, not from shame, but from fury. Because deep down she knew it would never change. He didn't want her to get better. He wanted her to stay small, stay damaged, stay manageable. That was his safety net. And now, after all that, after everything she'd clawed her way through, he still called her weak, still reduced her trauma to a character flaw. But what Mark would never understand was what PTSD had actually cost her. Not the sleep, not the flashbacks, not even the relationships it strained and snapped. It was the way it eroded trust, how it made every silence feel like accusation, how it taught her to second-guess every gut feeling, every moment of calm, as if peace itself was a lie waiting to break. Emily lived with that every day. In the stiffness of her shoulders when someone closed a door too hard, in the way she scanned every room without meaning to, in the way she locked her car doors twice, in the way she still couldn't fall asleep without a nightlight because darkness made the sounds worse. And yet, she had survived. She hadn't disappeared into it. She had fought to reclaim her mind from the echo chamber of combat, from the images of flame and blood and noise that had once colonized her every thought. Mark didn't see any of that. He saw a diagnosis and decided it was a scarlet letter, a warning label. He mocked what he couldn't control, what he couldn't understand, and worst of all, what he feared might expose him. Because Mark had always been afraid, not of war, not of fire, but of emotion, of fragility, of being seen for who he was when no one needed his dominance. Emily knew now that he feared her strength because it didn't look like his. It didn't bark orders. It didn't silence rooms. It persisted. It endured. It healed. And tonight, after his call, after the words that cut deeper than shrapnel ever had, she understood something else. Her PTSD wasn't her shame. It was her scar. Her proof that she had been to hell and lived. That she had walked through fire and hadn't let it own her. Mark wanted her to be ashamed, but shame was no longer part of her uniform. The only thing she wore now was truth. And the truth was this: he could mock her all he wanted, but he didn't get to define her anymore. He never did. Emily had always understood silence. She grew up in it. Not the peaceful kind, but the weaponized version, the kind used to punish, to belittle, to remind someone they didn't belong. After her mother married Mark, silence became the house language. He didn't yell. He didn't strike. He controlled with pauses, with glances, with questions phrased like verdicts. Everything was conditional. Respect, affection, even access to her mother's time. Emily was never outright banned from anything. Just slowly erased from the rooms that mattered. It started with subtle comments. "At 13, maybe you should sit this one out. This dinner's for the adults." At 16, "Are you sure the military is the best option? You've always been a little sensitive." By 18, Mark barely acknowledged her, unless it was to correct her. Her achievements were met with indifferent nods, her failures with long, meaningful silences. He turned the home into a court, and Emily was always the defendant. Her mother loved her, Emily knew that, but loving someone isn't always enough when they live with someone who edits reality. Mark knew how to control without lifting a finger. He isolated without ever locking a door. He'd shift facts in small, quiet ways that made Emily feel like she was overreacting. Gaslighting, the therapist had called it years later, but back then it was just Tuesday. One time, Emily overheard him telling a neighbor she struggled with emotional regulation. She was 14. She hadn't even raised her voice. But that became the new truth in the household. Anytime she spoke up, she was overreacting. Anytime she disagreed, she was being disrespectful. Eventually, she learned to keep her head down, to comply, to blend, to disappear. And when she left for the military, it wasn't patriotism that pushed her, it was survival. The military gave her a rank. Mark never gave her a name. When she returned on leave during her third deployment, Mark greeted her with a nod. No hug, no welcome, just a nod and a comment. Still into that whole hero phase, huh? That was Mark's way, always pretending her service was a phase of performance, as if her deployments were theater and not war, as if her PTSD was invented. He never asked about the missions, never asked about the friends she lost or the hours she spent flying evac flights in blackout conditions. Instead, he asked if she planned to get a real job once she was done playing soldier. Control for Mark wasn't about volume, it was about leverage, emotional blackmail wrapped in family dinners. The worst moments came after her mother's death when he took over everything: the will, the house, the narrative. He told friends that Emily had too much on her plate emotionally to handle estate matters. He told the lawyer she was in therapy and didn't need that kind of pressure. She found out through a third party that he had sold her mother's antique jewelry without asking. When she confronted him, he smiled. It was a small sale. I assumed you wouldn't want to hold on to pain. That was Mark's superpower. He made abuse sound like wisdom, like kindness. And if you questioned it, he made you feel like the villain. So Emily stopped questioning. She built walls instead. Therapy, distance, long deployments. She chose physical danger over emotional erosion because at least danger was honest. She knew where it stood. With Mark, the attacks came wrapped in family ties. They smelled like Sunday roast and sounded like concern. And now, years later, his voice on the phone still carried that same poison, soft, smooth cutting. He hadn't changed. He'd only become more polished. Emily knew she would never receive an apology. He wouldn't acknowledge the way he'd chipped away at her for years. But what he didn't know, what he would never see coming, was that his control didn't work anymore. It couldn't. Because she had finally learned how to speak the truth in a room full of silence. She no longer needed his approval. She no longer feared his gaze. And soon he'd learned that the girl he tried to erase was no longer erasing herself. The phone didn't ring again. That was the part that got to her. Not the insults, not the manipulation, but the fact that Mark could drop that kind of verbal grenade and move on without a second thought. Emily stared at her phone on the passenger seat as she pulled into her apartment complex. The rain had finally stopped, but her chest still felt soaked in that cold, familiar dread. She parked, turned off the engine, and sat in the dark. Her fingers hovered over the call history, tempted to delete it to erase the record of his voice, his words. But she didn't. She couldn't. She needed it. Not as proof for anyone else, but for herself. Proof that it really happened. That she wasn't imagining the poison. That she didn't overreact, didn't twist his words into weapons. They were already sharp before she heard them. Hours passed. Sleep didn't come. Instead, her mind replayed the call, each line dropping heavier than the last. By morning, her head ached and her chest felt like she'd been running in sand. She skipped breakfast, skipped coffee, and drove to the one place she knew she could find clarity, the Veterans Center. It wasn't therapy day, but the front desk staff knew her. She signed in, nodded politely, and slipped into one of the empty group rooms. It was quiet, dim, safe. She sat in the corner and let her body relax into the leather chair, the kind designed to make you feel held. Then her phone buzzed. Unknown caller. She almost ignored it until instinct made her answer. The voice on the other end was fast, urgent. It wasn't Mark. It was her mother's old neighbor, Mrs. Denny. "Emily, something's happened. It's Mark. There's been an accident." Her heart stuttered. "An accident. What kind? A pause. Car crash. On Ridgeview Road, the one near the ravine. It's bad. The car's on fire. They can't get him out. Her body moved before her brain did. She was out the door and into her Jeep in seconds. No plan, no hesitation, just instinct, just motion. The roads were slick, but she didn't care. She flew through intersections, adrenaline sharpening her focus. Ridgeview was 10 minutes away, but it felt like forever. As she turned the final corner, the scene came into view. Police lights, fire trucks, smoke curling into the air like dark ribbons. And there, tilted off the road, was a black SUV, Mark's car. Flames licked the hood. The front windshield was shattered. A firefighter turned toward her as she jumped from her vehicle. "Are you family?" She nodded. "He's pinned." The passenger side caught most of the impact, fires spreading fast. Emily didn't wait for permission. She pushed past the line tape ducked under an outstretched arm and ran. The heat hit her first like walking into a furnace. The smell of gasoline and burning rubber wrapped around her. She could barely see inside the cabin, but she heard him low groans, coughs muffled by metal and blood. Mark. Her feet hit gravel, then scorched asphalt. She reached the driver's side and yanked on the door. It wouldn't budge. She dropped to her knees, found the emergency latch, and pulled again. Still stuck. Through the cracked window, she saw his face, bloodied, confused eyes wide with pain and disbelief. "Emily," he choked. His voice was weak, but she heard it. "Please." That single word shattered something inside her. She braced her shoulder against the frame, summoned everything she had left, and shoved. The door gave half an inch, then another. Smoke poured out. Her lungs screamed. She coughed, turned her head, then pulled again. This time, it opened. Just enough. She reached in, unbuckled the belt, and dragged. His body was dead weight, but she moved like the fire was already on her heels. She didn't think. She didn't process. She just pulled. And then they were out. 5 feet. 10. Someone grabbed Mark from her arms, pulled him farther from the wreck. She stumbled back, coughing tears streaming not from emotion, but from smoke. The SUV erupted a second later, a loud, violent burst. Metal popped, glass shattered. And Emily stood there, ash in her hair, heart racing, hands trembling. She had saved him. The man who mocked her, who diminished her trauma, who controlled her life. She had pulled him from fire. And she didn't feel vindicated. Not yet. Only empty. Only alive. Only beginning. The hospital waiting room smelled like bleach and stale coffee. Emily sat in a corner chair, arms crossed, legs bouncing the same ash-streaked jeans still clinging to her skin. Her hair smelled like fire. Her hands were raw. She had washed them twice, but she could still feel the heat, the weight of Mark's body dragging against her grip. A nurse had checked her out. No burns, no fractures, but she didn't feel fine. She felt suspended like her body had returned from war before her mind had caught up. An officer approached with a clipboard, asked her for a statement. She answered robotically, eyes locked on the floor tiles. It wasn't until they wheeled Mark past on a gurney unconscious but alive that her breath caught. The side of his face, bruised and bandaged, snapped something loose inside her. She stood, walked slowly toward the hallway, and stopped at the glass door to his room. Machines beeped steadily. Oxygen hissed softly. His chest rose and fell steady but weak. And just like that, the memory hit her. Syria 2 years earlier. Night evac. 2 wounded soldiers in the back, one screaming, the other silent. Smoke inside the cockpit engine whining. She had flown blind through a sandstorm with only partial nav relying on gut and muscle memory. When they landed, she collapsed and no one clapped. Just like tonight. No one clapped when she dragged Mark from that fire. No one ran to embrace her or call her brave. And that was fine. She hadn't done it for them. But what haunted her now wasn't the lack of recognition. It was the voice in her head that still sounded like him. Weakness, drama, pity. She had saved the life of a man who'd built his identity around diminishing hers. And yet, she hadn't hesitated. Why? That was the question circling her mind now, like smoke. Why had she done it because she could? Because she was trained? or because somewhere buried deep under years of silence and cuts too small to see, she still believed in the duty to save even those who never deserved it. The nurse told her he would wake up soon. She could go in if she wanted. Emily shook her head. Not yet. Not like this. Instead, she walked outside out into the cool night air, the first clean breath she'd had in hours. She sat on the curb under a flickering streetlight, looked up at the stars, and felt smaller than she had in years. Not weak, not broken, just small. Human. Then her phone buzzed. A text. From someone she hadn't expected. Her cousin. Someone she barely spoke to since the funeral. Heard what happened. "You're a damn legend. He's lucky you were there." Her stomach twisted. Lucky. That word felt foreign in this context. Was he lucky, or had he just been given more time to continue pretending he was untouchable? Her thumbs hovered over the screen. She wanted to write something, anything, but no words felt right. She deleted the message. Then she opened her camera roll, stared at a photo taken last year. A picture of her in uniform, smiling, flanked by two fellow vets. In that photo, she looked whole, steady, strong. But she remembered that day, remembered how her hands had trembled just before the shot, how she had almost bailed on the event because the crowd noise had made her heart race. PTSD wasn't a straight line. It was a maze. And tonight, she had walked through fire to save someone who had once lit matches near every corner of her mind. And still, part of her had done it instinctively. That part terrified her. Not because it showed weakness, but because it revealed how deeply she still wanted to believe in something good, something redeemable, even when it hurt, even when it burned. But now, sitting on that curb, staring at a hospital full of beeping machines and buried secrets, she felt something shift. A fracture, maybe. Or the beginning of something clearer. She couldn't save him again. Not from the consequences. Not from himself. But maybe, just maybe, she could finally save herself. The news broke before the sun rose. A blurry video taken by a bystander had gone viral, flames licking the frame, voices screaming, and then clear as crystal. Emily dragging a man from a burning SUV. The caption read, "Veteran saves man from fiery crash, no gear, no hesitation." It spread like wildfire. Local outlets picked it up first, then national ones. Within 12 hours, Emily's name was trending. Her old squad mates messaged her non-stop. Some sent emojis of flames and medals. Others wrote long paragraphs calling her a badass, a warrior, a damn superhero. She read every message and responded to none. She wasn't ready. Not for attention, not for questions. And certainly not for the phone call that came next, an invitation to speak at a press conference organized by the fire department. They wanted to honor her. Give her a plaque, say thank you in front of cameras. She declined, politely, firmly. That wasn't why she did it. And she didn't want Mark's face plastered all over TV, didn't want to share a stage with the man who had mocked her, broken her down, erased her voice. But the story was out of her hands now. It belonged to the internet, which meant it belonged to everyone. And the internet had questions. Who was the man she saved? Why was she there? Were they related? Did she really suffer from PTSD? Was it safe for someone like her to make decisions in a crisis? Was she a hero or a ticking time bomb who just happened to land on the right side of the coin that night? Emily turned off her notifications. She avoided the articles. She stayed off social media. But silence didn't protect her from reality. It crept in through whispers. The local VA clinic buzzed with rumors. One counselor told her gently that reporters had called. Wanted background, wanted details, wanted an angle. Some speculated she had acted recklessly. Others said she had been unstable for years. One commentator on a podcast even suggested with an uncomfortable laugh that maybe she started the fire just to play the hero. Emily laughed too, briefly, bitterly. Then she went quiet. The worst part wasn't the lies. It was how easily people entertained them. How quickly heroism could be repackaged as instability, especially when it came from a woman, especially a woman with a diagnosis. She sat through 2 formal interviews with hospital administrators and first responders. They were professional, respectful, but the subtext lingered. Did you feel in control? Were you triggered during the rescue? Are you currently medicated? Her answers were calm, measured, sober. She wasn't surprised by the questions. She had spent years preparing for them. But each one left a mark, a reminder that survival alone wasn't enough. You had to survive correctly, publicly, with the right face and the right backstory. One misstep and the whole thing could collapse. That pressure, more than the fire, more than the screams, more than the flashbacks, was what exhausted her most. One afternoon, a woman approached her outside the clinic, middle-aged, nervous, carrying a small paper bag and a folded newspaper. "You don't know me," the woman said, "but my husband was in your unit. He didn't make it back. I watched your video. I just wanted to say thank you for surviving, for not letting them tell your story." Emily didn't cry, not in front of her. But later, alone in her apartment, she opened the paper. The headline, "From Fire to Freedom: How One Veteran Turned Trauma into Triumph." She didn't feel triumphant, not yet, but she felt seen, and that was something. Not enough, but something. The world was reacting. It had formed its opinion. Now it was her turn to choose what came next, whether to keep running from the noise or to walk straight into it with her head held high. Because this wasn't just her story anymore. It was every story that had been silenced, rewritten, doubted. And Emily. She was done being quiet. Emily didn't walk into battle. She walked into a bank. Not because she wanted money, but because the paper trail started there. For days, she had sat with the headlines, with the praise and the poison, with the rising tide of public attention that refused to settle. And somewhere between the 100th thank you and the 10th accusation, something inside her shifted. She stopped replaying the rescue. She started replaying the years that led to it. Mark hadn't just mocked her. He had built a foundation on top of her silence. Her mother's will, the financial records, the subtle erasures that turned into permanent exclusions. He had carved her out of the legacy without ever raising his voice. And now he lay in a hospital bed while the world clapped for her, not knowing she was also the one left with nothing. No property, no inheritance, no recognition of her place in her mother's life. So Emily requested records, quietly, legally. She knew what to ask for. Her military training hadn't taught her how to decode bank ledgers, but it had taught her how to find patterns in chaos. What she found wasn't shocking. It was worse than that. It was calculated. 4 years earlier, right after a flagged evaluation report from a training incident overseas, Mark had filed paperwork to amend trust control, claimed she was mentally unfit to inherit fiduciary responsibilities. The clause used language that echoed the worst lines from her military file, ones she had already fought to correct through formal review. He had taken a moment of weakness and frozen it in time, using it as a permanent mark against her. The documents had her name. The amendments didn't. Her share of the trust, reallocated to a shell firm, tied directly to Mark's private accounts. She found the trail because he had been lazy, assuming she would never look. That was his first mistake. The second was assuming she wouldn't use it. Emily printed everything: binders, tabs, copies. She met with a lawyer from the local veterans legal outreach program. When he read through the first 20 pages, he looked up slowly. "This is deliberate. You know that, right?" She nodded. He sat back, exhaled. "You could bury him with this." She didn't flinch. "I don't want to bury him. I want to remove him. From my mother's story. From mine." The next steps moved fast. Subpoenas, financial audits, testimony preparation. It wasn't a war with weapons. It was one with facts, structure, cold documentation. But it carried the same weight, the same readiness. She dressed each morning like she was suiting up again, not in uniform, but in purpose. No longer reactive, now strategic. The world had already seen her pull a man from fire. Now it would see her pull herself from a lifetime of silence. She didn't go to the press. She let the filings speak. When the hearings began, she sat in the front row, composed, factual, unflinching. Mark was wheeled in bruises, fading his arrogance, struggling to catch up with his recovery. He didn't meet her eyes, didn't acknowledge her. But when the evidence was presented line by line, date by date, signature by signature, he didn't speak. The judge reviewed the documentation with slow, heavy precision. The conclusion was swift. Fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, attempted misrepresentation of mental health for personal gain. The trust was restored, her name reinstated, his control severed. He didn't lose everything, but he lost control. And that was enough. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited. Cameras, microphones. One leaned forward. "Ms. Morgan, what does justice feel like?" She paused, then answered simply, like clarity. "No fireworks, no screaming, just truth, verified, recorded, delivered." And this time, no one could silence it, not even him. Emily didn't smile. She didn't pose. She walked past the cameras with her binder clutched like a medal that didn't glitter but weighed more than gold. Her hands no longer shook. Her posture didn't fold. She had saved a life. Now she had saved her story, and it wasn't over. Not yet. But the battlefield had changed, and this time she had the high ground. Mark never apologized. Not in court, not in the hospital, not after the legal filings were handed down or the judge's voice declared the reversal. He didn't look at Emily when the trust was restored in her name, nor when his rights were officially stripped. He sat in his chair like stone cold, still and silent. That silence had once been his weapon. Now it was all he had left. Emily didn't wait for remorse. She didn't need it. She had stopped chasing his validation the moment she dragged him out of fire and chose not to leave him there. But the world around them didn't forget. News outlets that had once painted Mark as the anonymous victim in a dramatic rescue now painted a fuller picture. Quiet headlines, not flashy, but honest. Veteran's stepfather found guilty of financial misconduct in family estate case. The public didn't riot. There was no pitchfork mob. Just a quiet shift in tone. Commenters updated their posts. Former neighbors whispered. A few people, the ones who had once shared dinners in his house and laughed at his cynical jokes, stopped returning his calls. Emily saw the ripple. She didn't gloat, but she watched. The man who had built his image on control now sat in a small condo on the outskirts of town, too proud for a retirement home, too exposed for comfort. When the fire had consumed his car, it had done more than threaten his life. It had exposed what he could no longer hide. His arrogance, his lies, his smallness. A reporter tried to schedule a follow-up story, a deep dive into Mark's past dealings. Emily declined. She had no interest in revenge theater. Her justice had already come. Not with sirens, with severance. The cut was clean, legal, permanent. But Mark still clung to the edge of relevance. He tried writing an op-ed painting himself as misunderstood, claimed the financial decisions were about protecting family assets, that Emily's trauma clouded her memory, that she was manipulated by lawyers, that her emotions made her vulnerable to exaggeration. The paper refused to print it, cited lack of evidence. He posted it online instead. It got 34 likes. 1 share. That was his audience now. A handful of loyal skeptics and old friends too stubborn to see the truth. Emily didn't reply. She never would. The best punishment wasn't rage. It was irrelevance. And that was what Mark had become. Not a villain in some grand narrative. Just a man who mistook control for connection, who built his legacy on silence and watched it evaporate when someone finally spoke. The last time Emily saw him was 6 months later at a memorial for her mother. She organized it herself, a proper one, not the cold, efficient service Mark had orchestrated years ago. This one was small, meaningful. Friends, photos, music her mother loved. Mark arrived late, in a wheelchair. He wore a gray suit too big for his frame. No one greeted him. No one offered a seat. He sat in the back alone, a faded figure in a room filled with warmth. Emily spoke at the front. She told stories, laughed softly at memories. Her voice didn't crack. It rang clear. When the ceremony ended, people lingered. Mark tried to approach, rolled his chair forward. Emily saw him nodded once, then turned away. That was all. No scene. No shouting. Just a silent boundary drawn in full view. After that day, he stopped trying. No more calls. No more letters. No more posts. He faded. Emily heard through a neighbor that he had moved states, some small apartment near his sister. They said he rarely left the house, that he had stopped speaking about the past, that his voice had lost its edge. She felt no triumph, just closure. And in that quiet space, she understood something vital. Forgiveness wasn't about letting him back in. It was about letting herself out of the prison his control built, out of the version of herself that waited for justice to be handed down instead of earned. She had earned it, with fire, with truth, with silence of her own, not to control, but to reclaim. There was no announcement, no grand declaration, just a quiet shift in Emily's mornings. She began each day with coffee instead of anxiety music, instead of headlines, the slow and steady realization that her shoulders no longer hunched by default. The weight she'd carried wasn't just Mark or the court or the headlines, it was the version of herself he had taught her to believe in, the fragile one, the volatile one, the broken one. But piece by piece, that narrative had been dismantled, not by sudden revelation, but by action. Quiet choices, saying no, saying yes, saying nothing when silence meant strength. One of her first steps was rebuilding what had been lost in the shadows of her trauma. She began volunteering at the VA center not as a patient, but as a mentor. Women showed up nervous, guarded stories brimming behind clenched jaws. Emily recognized the look in their eyes because she'd seen it in her own reflection for years. She didn't preach. She didn't present herself as a solution. She listened. She asked. She validated. Over time, she started a peer-led support group specifically for female veterans with PTSD. They called it Echo Wing, not a clinic, not therapy, a room, a circle, a place where voices didn't echo back empty but returned with understanding. One night, after a session, a young vet named Tanya stayed behind. She sat beside Emily, fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. "You ever think it gets better?" she asked. "Not easier, just better." Emily thought about the fire, the courtroom, her mother's face, Mark's silence. And then she answered. Not all at once, but piece by piece, yeah. It does. She didn't say it to offer hope. She said it because it was true. The next week, Tanya brought someone new, and that's how it spread. Quietly, organically. Not viral. Not viral like the video. Viral like healing. It didn't stop there. Emily began working with a nonprofit that advocated for legal rights of vets facing family-based financial exploitation. Her case had exposed a loophole that too many abusers had walked through without consequence. She testified in front of a small state committee. Her words weren't dramatic. They were deliberate, focused. "This isn't about punishment," she said. "It's about protection. About making sure no one uses silence and stigma as a weapon again." The bill passed 6 months later. Mark's name wasn't mentioned, but his shadow was everywhere in the ink. Meanwhile, Emily restored the pieces of her mother's memory that had been buried beneath legal red tape. She reclaimed the old piano from storage, the one Mark said was too sentimental to keep. She found photo albums packed away in mislabeled boxes, pictures she hadn't seen in over a decade. Her mother smiling, holding her, laughing with eyes that crinkled at the edges. Each photo felt like a returned chapter. She framed 2 of them, placed them on her mantel, not as a shrine, but as proof. Proof that her history wasn't a mistake, it had simply been stolen. Now it was hers again. All of it. And as the months passed, she noticed something even more surprising. Her PTSD didn't vanish. The nightmares still came, but they came less often. The flashbacks no longer knocked the wind out of her. When she walked into crowded rooms, her pulse still quickened, but she had tools. Breathing, grounding, self-trust. She didn't live without trauma. She lived with it, authentically, fearlessly, without apology. That she realized was the truest form of healing. Not perfection, not forgetting, just presence. One night she found herself back on Ridgeview Road, not intentionally, just a wrong turn that became a moment. She pulled over, parked, got out. The crash site was clean now. No scorched marks, no memorial. Just asphalt and wind and the memory of fire. She stood there for a minute, breathing in the stillness. And for the first time, she didn't feel haunted. She felt whole. Not because she had saved Mark, but because she had saved herself in the process, without even knowing it. That night, she drove home with the windows down, the air cold and crisp. And when she got home, she slept. No lights, no music, no fear, just sleep. Like peace finally had her name written on it. It was a Tuesday when Emily stood at the front of the community center facing a room full of strangers. Not military, not reporters, just people, neighbors, parents, teachers, social workers, men and women who had quietly RSVP'd to a workshop titled Breaking the Pattern, Recognizing Emotional Abuse in the Home. The folding chairs were plain, the lighting dim, but the air buzzed with unspoken truths. Emily didn't wear a uniform. She didn't bring a slideshow, no microphone, just her voice and a small stack of notes she never looked at. She began with a story. Not the one that went viral, not the fire, not the courtroom, but the quiet years, the long silence, the 1,000 cuts that came without bruises. She told them about Mark, not his name, but his shadow. The way his words twisted into her skin, the way control wasn't always loud, wasn't always fists. Sometimes it was a glance, a sigh, a joke that made you question your own memory. She spoke about her mother, about love wrapped in obligation, about how even strong women can be softened into silence when the home becomes a battleground of expectations. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She didn't ask for pity. She asked for recognition. For the people in the room to understand that abuse doesn't always leave marks, that survivors don't always look broken, that sometimes the most dangerous wounds are the ones you're trained to hide. A woman in the third row raised her hand, voice shaking. "How did you know it was time to stop hiding?" Emily paused. "I didn't. I knew it was time to act." The rest followed. That answer stayed in the room long after she moved on. When the session ended, no one rushed out. People lingered. A man approached and said his daughter had been silent for years, and maybe now he understood why. A teenager asked if she could volunteer for the next event. A counselor asked if Emily would help design a toolkit for recognizing non-physical abuse. She said yes to all of it, not because she wanted to be a leader, but because she had already been one on the battlefield in the courtroom and now in the healing. And with each yes, she felt the circle closing. Not the kind that traps you, the kind that completes something. Later that week, she returned to Echo Wing. It had grown 3 new faces. She brought cupcakes, no speech, just presence. They talked about triggers and breathwork, about how sometimes just getting out of bed is an act of defiance. Emily listened more than she spoke. That was leadership too. And when Tanya shared a journal entry about standing up to her father, the room didn't erupt. It nodded. It breathed with her. Because that was the cycle breaking in real time, not with explosions, with exhale. Emily drove home that night under a sky smeared with stars. No music, no noise, just thoughts. She passed Ridgeview Road again. She didn't turn, didn't need to. Her past didn't live there anymore. It lived in the hands she had steadied, in the voices she had amplified, in the future she had chosen not to repeat. That, more than any plaque or headline, was the legacy she wanted. Not survivor, not hero, just proof. That the cycle could end, that silence could be repurposed, that strength didn't always roar. It could whisper, it could build. It could pass from one hand to another like a candle catching flame. And as she pulled into her driveway, lights off moonlight on her face, Emily whispered to herself the one truth she had waited years to believe. I am no longer the house they built. I am the fire they couldn't extinguish. And in that quiet declaration, the story closed. Not with revenge, not with regret, but with release.